The first sound was not of laughter nor of song, but of a gentle hum carried on the wind. It drifted across the shore one night long ago, a sound so soft that it could have been mistaken for the ocean breathing, or for the faintest memory of a lullaby. It was here, in that quiet hum, that Stephen's story began, not with a battle or a grand announcement, but with something smaller, stranger, and infinitely more tender. Those who were listening felt a calm wash over them, as if the hum itself cared for them. And so, from the very beginning, Stephen's world was rooted not only in mystery, but in love. We truly love you too. We care that you are here, listening, wherever you might be in the world. This story is not just Stephen's, it is also yours. Before we begin the journey in full, tell us, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Hold that answer softly in your mind like a star cupped in your palm. Now let's get started. Stephen was still a child when the strangeness of his life revealed itself in gentle fragments. While other children collected seashells along the shore, he collected moments, the shimmer of light on wet sand, the shape of clouds drifting above his town, the sound of waves folding and unfolding in rhythm. He often believed the world spoke to him, not in words, but in quiet symbols only he seemed to notice. Sometimes he laughed at it. Other times he just lay on his back in the grass, gazing upward, letting the sky teach him patience. His earliest memories were filled with soft contradictions. His father's music, humming through a broken amplifier, was both loud and gentle, filling their small space with a warmth that clung to the walls. The gems, who cared for him like guardians, offered lessons that were sometimes stern, sometimes playful, yet always wrapped in a thread of devotion. To Stephen, love never looked just one way. It was laughter over a poorly made sandwich, a gem's quiet correction when he made a mistake, or the weight of a blanket tucked around him before sleep. Lion entered his life like a secret, whispered in the middle of a sentence. At first, Stephen didn't know what to make of him. The creature seemed too mysterious, too still, his pink mane holding something far deeper than any ordinary pet could. Yet, despite his strangeness, Lion rested beside Stephen as if he had been waiting for him all along. Stephen learned to trust Lion's silences, the way he stood between him and fear. The way his eyes seemed to hold memories of someone Stephen had never met, and yet always longed to understand. These beginnings were not grand in the way of fairy tales. No enchanted castles, no thunderous entrances. Instead, they were woven of small, delicate strands, the clinking of teacups on the kitchen table, the rhythm of footsteps in sand, the laughter that followed a joke not because it was funny, but because it was shared. In this way, Stephen's life revealed itself as something more than ordinary, but never hurried. His story was destined to be one of patience, of noticing, of stretching small things into meaning. When he was very young, Stephen liked to believe that every cloud above Beach City carried a secret. He would lie in the grass with his arms spread wide and name them as they drifted by. One was a castle, another a hand waving goodbye, another still a sandwich floating lazily toward the horizon. The gems sometimes joined him, each seeing shapes he had not noticed, their interpretations colored by the long, complicated lives they had lived. It was in these moments that Stephen first understood perspective, that the same sky could hold 1,000 meanings, depending on who gazed upon it. His curiosity often led him into unusual places. He once followed the trail of a seagull's cry, believing it would lead him to something hidden. Instead, he stumbled upon a hollow shell that sang faintly when the wind passed through. Stephen pressed it to his ear and swore it whispered his name. Whether true or not didn't matter. What mattered was that the world felt alive, responsive, as if it leaned closer whenever he opened his heart. Greg, his father, encouraged this wonder in simple ways. He would strum his guitar on the porch, filling the air with music that seemed to braid itself with the breeze. "The world's always singing," Greg told him once. "You just have to listen long enough to hear it." Stephen carried that idea with him, storing it like a lantern in his chest, lighting the dark whenever confusion grew heavy. The gems taught him in their own ways. Pearl urged him to look closely, to notice the delicate order hidden in patterns. Garnet, steady and calm, reminded him that strength often meant standing still long enough to let truth reveal itself. Amethyst laughed at seriousness, teaching him that sometimes wonder could be found not in answers, but in laughter itself. Each of them shaped the way Stephen grew, not by pushing him towards something sharp and grand, but by guiding him gently into the rhythm of who he already was. Even then, questions lingered like shadows. There were whispers of a past that belonged to someone else, a mother he had never met but who had left traces everywhere. He did not yet understand what those whispers meant, only that sometimes the silence around her name felt louder than words. At night, when he could not sleep, he pressed his ear against Lion's mane, listening for something hidden. He didn't always hear it, but the act itself comforted him. The belief that secrets did not have to be solved all at once, that they could rest quietly until the heart was ready. And so Stephen's childhood unfolded like a song sung softly at dusk. It was filled with small rituals, the making of sandwiches with uneven layers, the building of forts that always collapsed but were always rebuilt, the searching of tide pools for hidden treasures that glimmered only when the sun caught them right. Nothing seemed extraordinary, and yet everything did, because Stephen's gaze turned even the simplest moment into something luminous. These were the beginnings, fragile, patient, strange, and beautiful. They did not demand urgency. They simply unfolded one quiet moment at a time. In the stillness of those early days, Stephen learned something he would carry forever, that love was not only found in answers or in grand gestures. Love was already there, in the laughter of friends, in the weight of a hand resting gently on his shoulder, in the unspoken hum of the universe itself. And as he closed his eyes one night, lulled by the ocean's endless rhythm, Stephen whispered to no one and to everything all at once, "I'm glad I'm here." The stars above did not answer, yet their quiet shining felt like a response. Stephen was a boy with too much heart. People in Beach City noticed it before he ever realized it himself. He would stand by the shoreline, watching the waves tumble and return, and somehow he seemed to listen to them as though they were old friends telling him secrets. While other children ran and shouted, Stephen often sat quietly, humming to himself, trying to imagine what the tide might be trying to say. There was something unusual about the way he carried his kindness. It was not loud or showy, but gentle, like a lantern hidden beneath a blanket, softly glowing, softly waiting. When Stephen was very young, he would talk to the stars. He thought of them as distant cousins scattered across the sky. He would lie on the roof of the temple house, legs swinging off the side, and whisper to them about his day, how the donut shop smelled in the morning, how Amethyst made him laugh so hard he spilled juice all over his shirt, how Pearl scolded him but in a way that still felt safe. He believed the stars listened, and even when they didn't answer, he trusted their quiet. In a way, that trust was already teaching him something important, that love can exist even when words are never spoken back. There was a strangeness in Stephen, though he didn't quite know how to name it. Sometimes, when he pressed his hand against a small wound, a soft warmth spread through his palm, and the ache would ease. Sometimes, when he sang softly to himself, even the air seemed to breathe differently, calmer, lighter. He didn't think of it as power. To him, it was simply the way feelings worked. If you carried enough care inside of you, maybe it spilled out into the world and fixed what was broken. He never tried to make it grand. He never told himself he was special. He only wanted people, and even little animals, to feel safe the way he longed to feel safe himself. Stephen's quirks often puzzled the gems. Garnet, tall and composed, would observe him in silence and then nod as though she understood something no one else could. Pearl would frown gently, tilting her head, caught between worry and wonder. Amethyst would tease him sometimes. "You're such a softy, Stephen." But even in her teasing there was warmth, as though she secretly admired the softness she herself had a harder time showing. What they all realized in different ways was that Stephen's greatest strength was not what shimmered in his gem or what he might one day grow to do. It was his way of seeing the world as tender, worth saving not through grand battles but through small, deliberate kindness. One evening when the sky was streaked with pink and lavender, Stephen sat by the ocean with Lion resting beside him. The sand was cool under his legs, and Lion's mane glowed faintly with the last light of the day. Stephen leaned against the great creature, sighing in that way children do when they are carrying questions too large for them. "Do you think I'm supposed to be like my mom?" he whispered, not sure if Lion would understand. Lion didn't answer, of course, but the steady rhythm of his breath was answer enough. In that silence, Stephen felt both the weight and the comfort of his inheritance. He didn't have to be exactly like Rose, he only had to be himself, whatever that might slowly mean. There were times Stephen felt caught between two worlds. One was filled with magic, gems, strange places hidden in warp pads and memories stored inside pink light. The other was ordinary beach city, where the smell of fries drifted out from the boardwalk and the sound of seagulls argued overhead. He belonged to both worlds and yet to neither completely. He would run errands for the gems in the morning, then spend his afternoon listening to Lars and Sadie argue in the Big Donut, quietly laughing to himself. To Stephen there was no sharp divide between the extraordinary and the ordinary. They both mattered. They both carried their own flavor of truth. What made him different was that he noticed things others passed by. He noticed the way Connie's voice trembled when she tried to sound brave. He noticed how Pearl's hands shook when she polished a sword, as if memory clung to her fingers. He noticed how Amethyst, loud and brash, sometimes fell into long silences when no one was watching. He noticed how Garnet often stood just a little too still, like someone carrying the weight of two hearts instead of one. He carried these details quietly, tenderly, and though he didn't always know what to do with them, his noticing was itself an act of care. People often long simply to be seen. Stephen saw them, and in seeing them, he gave them something close to peace. On a quiet afternoon, he sat on the porch with a sandwich he had made clumsily, too much mayonnaise sliding out from the bread. He laughed at the mess, wiping his chin, and felt suddenly grateful for the smallness of the moment. The wind was gentle, carrying the salt of the sea. He could hear the gems inside, faint voices arguing softly about missions and responsibilities. For once, none of it pressed on him. He was just a boy eating a sandwich, watching the horizon. And yet, even in such a simple hour, there was a sense that something sacred was taking place, because life, he thought, was not in the grand announcements, but in the quiet breath between them. That night, he dreamed of his mother again. Not her face, he could never see it clearly in dreams, but her presence, like a warm echo that made the dream feel safe. In the dream, he reached out to touch a glow, and it pulsed beneath his fingertips, as though waiting for him to understand. He woke with a small ache in his chest, a longing not sharp enough to wound, but soft enough to linger. Sitting up in bed, he whispered into the dark, "I'll try, Mom." He didn't know exactly what he meant by it, but it felt like the right promise to make. As days turned into seasons, Stephen's heart continued to stretch, not like a balloon ready to burst, but like a tree quietly reaching for the sky. He learned in small ways that his softness was not weakness but strength. When Onion sat silently beside him, chewing on something mysterious, Stephen didn't push him to speak. He simply sat too, creating a space where silence was accepted. When Connie confessed her fears about not fitting in, Stephen didn't try to fix them. He only said, "I feel like that sometimes too." And suddenly she smiled with relief. When Amethyst tried to make him laugh after a difficult day, Stephen let himself laugh even though his chest was heavy, because sometimes laughter was the gentlest way of saying, "I love you." People called him strange, but he thought of himself as simple. He didn't always understand the legacy of his gem, or the secrets the gems carried, or even the mysteries hiding inside Lion's mane. But he understood that people hurt and that they needed love. And maybe, he thought, if he could offer love in small doses, through a song, a hug, a quiet listening ear, then maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Late one evening, when the stars were thick above the ocean and the temple lights glowed warmly behind him, Stephen whispered aloud to no one in particular, "I just want everyone to feel safe." The sea responded with its endless hush, as though agreeing. Lion flicked his ear and nudged Stephen softly, almost like a nod. And in that moment, Stephen felt something settle inside of him. Not certainty, not answers, but a kind of peace. A peace that told him he didn't need to know everything yet. He only needed to keep loving as fiercely as his little heart allowed. And so the boy with too much heart lay down on Lion's side, the mane rising and falling beneath his cheek, and closed his eyes. The waves whispered their lullabies, the stars kept their silent vigil, and Stephen drifted gently into sleep, soft, safe, and whole, even in his questions. The first time Stephen discovered the hidden space inside Lion, he thought it must have been a dream. The air had been unusually still that afternoon, the kind of stillness that makes you feel as though the world is holding its breath. He had been playing by the shore, tossing small rocks into the sea, when Lion wandered up beside him, mane glinting faintly with colours that were not entirely of the earth. Stephen buried his fingers into the thick pink fur, sighing as if to release a secret he hadn't even spoken. And then quite suddenly he was pulled forward, slipping past what felt like a curtain of starlight. For a heartbeat he panicked, but just as quickly the panic melted into wonder. He was standing in a place that was both a room and not a room, quiet but alive, as if the air itself remembered things too important to forget. It wasn't large, but it felt endless. Soft light hovered, neither bright nor dim, like a lantern beneath a blanket. Stephen turned slowly, eyes wide. He saw objects floating in the space, delicate, carefully placed things that seemed to belong to someone who had loved deeply and wanted their love to be remembered. There was a sword, shining faintly with purpose. There were scattered papers, curled at the edges, as if waiting for someone to pick them up again. And there was a pink petal drifting as if on an invisible breeze, though no wind stirred. Stephen's breath caught in his chest, not out of fear, but out of reverence. It was like walking into someone's diary, every page a whisper. Every whisper a part of a story he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. He reached out, fingers trembling, and touched one of the objects, a small fabric flag folded neatly against a chest. It was soft, worn from being held too often. He imagined his mother's hands pressing it smooth, setting it down with a quiet sigh. He wondered if she had known, as she tucked these things away, that one day her son would find them. The thought warmed and ached all at once. It was strange, he realized, how a room could feel like an embrace, even when it was filled only with silence. Filled only with silence. Lion stood beside him, massive and calm, as though he understood everything. Stephen looked up at him, whispering, "Is this her? Did she leave this for me?" Lion did not speak, but his steady gaze was answer enough. Stephen's chest tightened, full of questions he could not put into words. He thought of how the gems often guarded their memories, their stories of Rose, like treasures locked away. Here, though, in this hidden place, the memories were not guarded. They were waiting, patient and tender, as though they belonged to him as much as to her. The strangeness of it all was not frightening. It was gentle. The space seemed to hum faintly, Not with sound, but with feeling, as though the very walls wanted to soothe him. Stephen sat cross-legged on the invisible floor, letting the quiet seep into him. He thought about how every person, every heart, might carry rooms like this inside them, hidden spaces filled with keepsakes of memory and love. Most people never showed them. Most people never invited anyone inside. But perhaps everyone, deep down, carried a place like Lion's Mane, where the most fragile pieces of their story were kept safe. He stayed there for what felt like hours, though time seemed different in that room. Eventually, his eyes rested on a small chest tucked in the corner. He approached it slowly, heart beating fast but steady. When he opened it, he found a videotape resting inside, labeled in handwriting he had never seen before, but instantly recognized. His mother's. His hands shook as he picked it up. He did not press play then, not yet. He only held it close, pressing it to his chest, as though by doing so he might feel her pulse through it. The weight of it was more than plastic and tape. It was the weight of longing, of connection, of a message left across time. When he finally stepped back through Lion's Mane into the sunlight, the air smelled sharp with salt, the seagulls circling overhead as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything had changed. Stephen sat in the sand, tape in hand, and felt the kind of quiet that comes only when you stand at the edge of something much larger than yourself. He didn't rush to show the gems, didn't rush to tell Connie. He let the silence wrap around him, letting the discovery settle like soft rain into the soil of his heart. In the days that followed, Stephen thought often about the hidden room. Sometimes, lying awake in bed, he wondered what it meant to carry a space inside you, filled with fragments of memory. He thought of the gems, how Garnet seemed steady because she carried a future inside her, how Pearl's every gesture seemed guided by memories she could never put down, how Amethyst laughed loudly enough to hide the quiet places within her. Perhaps, Stephen mused, every person was like Lion in their own way. Perhaps everyone carried more inside than anyone else could ever see. The thought did not frighten him. It comforted him, because if the world was made of hidden rooms, then every person was a mystery waiting to be understood. And Stephen, with his too big heart, wanted to understand. He didn't always need to open the rooms. Sometimes, he thought, just knowing they were there was enough. Just knowing someone carried a whole universe inside them made him love them even more. One evening, he returned to the hidden space. Lion allowed him to step through again, mane parting like a curtain of dusk. This time Stephen sat with the objects, not touching them, only looking. The sword shimmered faintly, a reminder of battles fought not for glory, but for love. The papers seemed to breathe with untold stories. The flag lay still as though asleep. He whispered to the room itself, "I'll take care of this. I promise." His voice was quiet, but it felt like the room heard him. For a moment, he thought he saw the petal drift closer to him, as though acknowledging his vow. Back outside, the world was unchanged. The ocean still rolled. The stars still blinked into being. Yet Stephen felt different. He felt as though he had been entrusted with something sacred. Not a mission, not a burden, just a truth that love leaves traces, and if you look closely enough, you can find them tucked away, waiting to be remembered. That night, as he lay in bed, Stephen thought of his own hidden room. He imagined what it might hold. Connie's laughter, Amethyst's jokes, Pearl's careful lessons, Garnet's reassuring silence. He imagined sandwiches shared on the beach, clouds drifting lazily above, Lion's steady breath beside him. He imagined someday, far in the future, someone stepping into his hidden space and finding those moments carefully folded, waiting. And he hoped, with all his heart, that whoever found them would feel what he felt now. Not sorrow, not confusion, but love. Pure, simple, endless love. Stephen closed his eyes, smiling softly to himself. He whispered into the dark, not sure if anyone could hear. "I'll keep the room safe. I'll keep all the rooms safe." And with that, he drifted into sleep, carrying the quiet of Lion's hidden world into his dreams. Stephen held the videotape in his hands for days before he found the courage to press play. It sat on his dresser, quiet and unassuming, yet heavy in a way that pulled at him whenever he passed by. Sometimes he would pick it up, run his fingers over the label, trace the familiar but unfamiliar curves of handwriting. Other times, he would leave it where it was and try to distract himself with small things. Feeding Lion, helping Garnet organize star charts, laughing at Amethyst's messy jokes, letting Pearl guide him through songs he only half understood. But no matter how busy the days felt, the tape waited. It waited with patience that made his heart ache. It was not demanding. It was simply there, like the ocean, eternal and unchanging, whispering quietly until he was ready to listen. He often wondered what he would hear once he pressed play. Would it be a voice filled with love, spilling over like a song he had never heard, but somehow always known? Or would it be something harder, a voice filled with truths he wasn't ready to carry? The not knowing was almost heavier than the tape itself. Sometimes, at night, lying under the glow of stars outside his window, he would whisper questions aloud.
"Mum, what did you want to tell me? Why couldn't you stay?"
The stars never answered, but their silence was kind. The kind of silence that doesn't judge. The kind that holds space for sorrow and wonder side by side. The day he finally chose to watch, the sky was soft with grey clouds. The house was quiet. The gems had gone on a mission. Lion stretched lazily outside and the world seemed to be waiting with him. Stephen placed the tape gently into the player, his hands trembling as if he were cradling something living. He sat on the floor, legs crossed, staring at the screen with wide eyes. The moment the static cleared and the image sharpened, his breath caught. There she was, Rose, not a statue, not a photograph.
Not someone else's memory, but moving, alive.
Speaking, her voice was softer than he imagined, filled with warmth that wrapped around him like a blanket. "Hello, Stephen," she began, smiling in that way that felt like sunrise. "I don't know what you'll be like when you see this. I don't know what you'll love, what you'll dream of, or who you'll become. But I do know one thing, you are already loved." Stephen's throat tightened. The words pressed into him like waves against sand, shaping something inside of him he hadn't realized was waiting to be shaped. As she continued, she spoke not of battles, not of victories, but of small things, how she loved the feel of the wind through the grass, how she marveled at how humans found joy in laughter, in food, in stories. She spoke of the strangeness of existing in two worlds at once, of carrying responsibility and yet wanting nothing more than to be gentle. She admitted she did not have all the answers, that she often stumbled, that her love was imperfect but real. Stephen listened, tears gathering quietly at the corners of his eyes, not falling yet, but shimmering, held by the weight of her voice. She told him, "I won't be there to see the person you become. That will be your journey, not mine. But please know, every step you take, I am with you. In your heart, in your laughter, in your kindness,
I am there." At that, Stephen could no longer hold back.
The tears slipped free, falling silently down his cheeks. He pressed his palm to the screen, as if by touching the glass he could reach through to her. He whispered, "I'm here, Mum. I'm listening." The glow of the video blurred through his tears, but the voice was clear, steady, unwavering. The message ended more quickly than he expected. A final smile, soft and lingering, filled the screen. "Goodbye, my future.
I love you." And then the screen faded into static, the sound like distant rain.
Stephen sat there long after the tape had finished, the silence of the room holding him gently. He did not feel abandoned in that moment. He felt seen, as though she had reached across time to place her hand softly on his shoulder. The ache was still there, deep and familiar, but it was now accompanied by something else, a fragile, glowing thread of connection. He rewound the tape carefully, almost reverently, and returned it to Lion's Mane, where he knew it would be safe. He did not need to watch it again right away. Once was enough to plant the seed. He would return to it, he knew, when the time was right, when the questions inside him grew louder. For now, he wanted to carry the echo of her words, like a song humming softly at the edge of his heart. That evening, Stephen walked along the shore, his sandals dangling from his hand, feet sinking into the damp sand. The ocean stretched endlessly, grey and silver under the fading light. He thought about how small he felt, and yet how connected, how even his smallness was part of something vast and unbroken. He thought of his mother's voice, of the way it had held no pretense, no grand declarations, just love simple and unadorned. That was what he wanted to carry forward. Not a legacy of power, but of kindness. Not a history of battles, but of laughter and safety. When he returned home, Connie was waiting on the steps of the temple, book in hand. She looked up as he approached, noticing the redness of his eyes. "You watched it, didn't you?" she asked softly. Stephen nodded, unable to speak at first. Connie closed her book, placed it beside her, and waited. That was something he always loved about her. Her patience, her way of giving him space without filling it with noise. Finally, he sat beside her, leaning his shoulder against hers.
"She told me she loved me," he whispered.
"She said she'd always be with me." Connie's eyes softened, and she squeezed his hand. "She was right," she said. "She is." They sat together in silence, the night rising around them, stars slowly appearing overhead. Stephen thought of all the rooms people carried inside them, all the hidden spaces filled with memories and messages and love. He thought of the tape as one such room, opened for him at just the right time. He wondered what Connie's hidden room might hold, what amethysts or pearls or garnets might look like. He wondered what his own room would hold one day when someone else looked back at him with longing. The thought did not make him afraid. It made him feel part of something larger, a chain of love and memory stretching beyond what any of them could see. Later, as he drifted into sleep, Stephen felt the words of the tape settle into his dreams. "I love you." They repeated softly, not echoing, but cradling him, as though the universe itself was whispering. He turned on his side, Lion's heavy breathing steady nearby, and smiled through the last traces of tears. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know how he would grow, or what choices he would face. But he knew with a certainty as deep as the ocean that he was loved, and sometimes that was enough. Stephen had always known the gems were different from him, yet he never thought of that difference as a distance. If anything, it drew him closer. They were like facets of a family carved out of strange light and ancient stories, and though their ways sometimes puzzled him, he felt held in their orbit the way the moon is held by the earth. Each of them taught him something without ever saying they were teaching, and slowly, quietly, Stephen grew through the bonds that shimmered between them. With Garnet, he found stillness. She rarely explained herself, never wasted words, but her presence was like a compass, always pointing toward calm. Stephen would sit near her while she meditated, cross-legged and fidgeting at first, then gradually letting his breathing find her rhythm. Sometimes he would ask questions, small ones about the stars, about the future, about what she saw when her eyes glowed with visions. Garnet almost never answered directly. Instead, she gave him fragments, gentle clues, or silence that stretched until Stephen began to understand the answer himself. At first, it frustrated him, but then he realized it was her way of teaching him patience, her way of showing that not all truths are handed down, they bloom when the heart is ready. He began to treasure those silences because in them he felt her trust. She believed he could figure things out, and that belief wrapped around him more securely than any blanket. Amethyst, on the other hand, was chaos wrapped in laughter. She loved to pull him into games that made no sense, to transform into ridiculous shapes just to hear him laugh, to challenge him to races she rarely finished because she got distracted halfway.
Stephen adored her for it.
She reminded him that life did not always have to be serious or heavy, even when the world seemed to insist otherwise. But beneath her jokes, Stephen noticed the cracks. Sometimes her laughter was too loud, too quick, as if to cover something else. Sometimes she would grow quiet when she thought no one was watching, eyes distant, mouth pressed tight. Stephen never asked her about those silences. He just sat nearby, offering a goofy grin or humming a tune, letting her know she wasn't alone. Over time, he realized that this too was a lesson, that love isn't always about fixing someone's sorrow. Sometimes it's about standing beside them, steady and gentle, until they remember they don't have to carry it alone. Then there was Pearl, whose careful hands and precise words could make even the simplest task feel like a ceremony. She fussed over Stephen, corrected him, worried over his safety more than anyone else. At first, he thought she simply didn't trust him. But the older he grew, the more he saw the tenderness hidden beneath her sharp edges. She wasn't doubting him. She was afraid of losing him. Every time she scolded him for being careless, every time she hovered with too much instruction, it was because her heart was still tangled with the memory of losing someone before. Stephen didn't always understand her words, but he understood her heart, and that was enough. He found ways to ease her worry, singing while he worked so she would know he was fine, asking her to teach him small things like folding laundry or polishing stones so she could feel useful in his growth. And in return, she taught him to care for details, to treat even small acts as threads in a larger tapestry. Together, the three gems created a kind of harmony, though it wasn't perfect. They argued, disagreed, sometimes snapped at each other in ways that made Stephen's chest ache. But even in their discord, there was love. Stephen noticed it most in the way they always circled back, always found their way to laughter or quiet understanding after the storm passed. From them he learned that family wasn't about never breaking. It was about breaking and still returning again and again with forgiveness and tenderness stronger than before. One evening, after a long day of helping around Beach City, Stephen sat with them on the beach. The sunset painted the ocean in bands of gold and violet, and the four of them sat in a loose circle, sand cool beneath them. Stephen looked at each of them, wanting to tell them what they meant to him, but the words caught in his throat. Garnet's steady gaze met his and softened, as though she already knew. Amethyst tossed a pebble into the waves, smirking but glancing at him with quiet affection. Pearl adjusted her posture, straight and precise, but her eyes shimmered with the same question that lingered in his chest. Was this enough?
Was he enough?
Stephen reached down, picked up a seashell, and held it out to them. "We're like this," he said softly. "Different shapes, different colors, but together we're still one thing." His voice trembled, but his smile was steady. Garnet chuckled low, Amethyst snorted, and Pearl blinked rapidly as though she were fighting tears.
None of them answered with words.
Instead, they simply leaned a little closer, letting the circle tighten, letting the quiet hold them. It was in moments like this that Stephen felt his heart stretch wider. He began to understand that family is not measured by perfection, but by the closeness that lingers even after mistakes. He began to see his own softness mirrored in their different ways. Garnet's quiet strength, Amethyst's laughter hiding hurt, Pearl's devotion carried in trembling hands. Each of them held something fragile, and each of them trusted Stephen enough to show it. That trust was his gift as much as his inheritance. Later that night, lying in bed, Stephen whispered into the dark, "Thank you." He wasn't sure if he was speaking to them, to his mother, or to the universe itself.
Maybe all three.
His eyes grew heavy, and he let himself imagine the three gems as stars in the sky, each shining in their own color, each guiding him forward in ways they didn't always realize. The thought comforted him. Even if the world grew strange or frightening, he would not be alone. He carried them with him, just as surely as he carried his own gem. And so he drifted into sleep with a heart full of bonds, quiet, imperfect, but unbreakable. In his dreams, he saw garnet's calm, amethyst's laughter, pearl's careful hands. He saw them not as guardians or warriors, but as family, stitched together by love that needed no explanation. Stephen had always felt drawn to creatures others overlooked. Maybe it was his own sense of being different, half human and half gem, or maybe it was the way his heart seemed tuned to gentleness, like a song carried on the wind. Whatever the reason, when he first met Lion, he knew instantly that this was no ordinary companion. The desert shimmered with heat the day they crossed paths, sand stretching endless in all directions, and there among the dunes stood a creature of pink fur, his mane glowing faintly with otherworldly light. Stephen blinked, rubbed his eyes, half convinced he was seeing a mirage. But when Lion padded closer, silent and majestic, Stephen felt no fear. Instead, he felt recognition, as though the universe itself had placed them on the same path. At first, Lion was distant. He was not like a pet who craved attention or played fetch. He watched Stephen with eyes too knowing, as if measuring him. Stephen, however, was patient. He offered kindness without demand, sitting near Lion for hours in the shade of a rock, humming little tunes, letting their silence grow into something comfortable. Slowly, Lion began to trust him, padding closer, until one day he simply lay down beside Stephen, heavy warmth pressed against his side. In that moment, Stephen's heart soared. He whispered, "You're my friend." And though Lion said nothing, his slow, steady breathing seemed like an answer. Life with Lion was not simple. Sometimes he would vanish without warning, leaving Stephen searching the desert or the beach with worry in his chest. Sometimes he would act aloof, ignoring Stephen's calls, making him wonder if he had imagined the bond between them. But then, in quiet moments, Lion would appear again, soft mane brushing against Stephen's hand, eyes deep with unspoken comfort. Stephen came to realize that friendship is not about constant presence. It is about trust, that even when distance stretches between you, the bond remains, unbroken and waiting. One evening, Stephen discovered that Lion's mane was more than it appeared. Reaching into the pink fur, his hand brushed against something impossible, a pocket of space, glowing and vast, filled with echoes of a life he barely understood. Inside lay treasures left behind by rose quartz, his mother, keepsakes, memories, fragments of a history Stephen was only beginning to uncover. He trembled as he pulled out a sword, its weight heavy not just in his hand, but in his heart. Lion watched him, calm and patient, as though guiding him toward truths he wasn't yet ready to face. Stephen didn't know whether to feel comforted or overwhelmed. On one hand, Lion was giving him a bridge to his mother, a way to touch pieces of her life. On the other, it reminded him of the mystery that still surrounded her, the distance between what he wanted to know and what he was ready to understand. Yet Lion never pressed him. He simply carried those memories within his mane, waiting for the day Stephen felt strong enough to reach for them again. That patience, that quiet guardianship, made Stephen love him even more. There were times Lion acted almost like a protector. When danger stirred, his roar could shake the air, fierce and thunderous, scattering threats like leaves in a storm. But afterward, he would nuzzle Stephen's shoulder with surprising gentleness, reminding him that even strength could be tender. Stephen cherished those moments most, when the line between guardian and companion blurred, when Lion became something more than either. He was a bridge between worlds, a reminder that love could be fierce without losing its softness. In the stillness of night, Stephen often curled up against Lion's side,
lulled to sleep by the steady thrum of his breathing.
The warmth of fur beneath his cheek was grounding, the scent of desert wind and sun-bleached sand lingering in the mane. Sometimes, Stephen would dream of wide pink plains where Lion ran, swift and endless, carrying him across landscapes both real and imagined. He would wake with the echo of wind in his ears, certain that Lion had taken him somewhere safe while he slept. But friendship is not only comfort, it is also challenge, and Lion had ways of pushing Stephen toward growth. There were times when Stephen wanted to cling to the safety of childhood, to hide from responsibility, but Lion nudged him forward, sometimes literally.
A shove of a paw, a glance toward a place he needed to be, a growl that rumbled like a reminder.
Stephen grumbled, complained, even pouted at times, but he always listened. And in hindsight, he realized Lion was guiding him toward strength he didn't yet know he carried. The townsfolk of Beach City often marveled at Lion. Children reached out to touch his mane. Adults whispered about his strange color, his silent dignity. Some were wary, but most accepted him because Stephen did. To them, Lion was another mystery in a town already brimming with wonders. To Stephen, he was a confidant, a friend who held pieces of his heart the way his mane held fragments of Rose's past. He didn't need others to understand. It was enough that he knew. One quiet afternoon, Stephen sat by the water's edge, Lion stretched beside him, eyes half closed in the sunlight. Stephen traced circles in the sand with his finger, thinking aloud,
"Do you think I'm doing okay?"
"Do you think Mom would be proud?" His voice cracked on the last word, but Lion did not stir. Instead, he gave a long, slow sigh as if exhaling Stephen's doubt into the wind. The boy smiled faintly. "Yeah, I guess you're right."
"She gave me you, didn't she?"
"That has to mean something." The tide washed in and out, a rhythm older than both of them, and Stephen leaned against Lion's mane, letting its softness soak up the weight of his worry. Over time, Stephen began to realize that Lion wasn't simply Rose's gift. He wasn't merely a messenger or a vessel of secrets. He was his own being with his own choices, his own quiet mysteries. He chose to stay, to walk beside Stephen, to offer his strength and his silence. That choice made their bond even deeper. It wasn't inheritance that tied them together. It was love freely given, day after day, in the unspoken language of companionship. As the years stretched on, their connection only grew stronger. Stephen no longer saw Lion as a creature apart from him, but as part of his very life's fabric. When he imagined the future, Lion was always there, steady and pink against the horizon, a reminder that some bonds never fade.
Even in the face of change, even in the shadow of questions left unanswered,
Lion's presence was an anchor. That night, lying once more beneath the stars, Stephen curled against Lion and whispered, "You're not just a pet. You're family. You're part of me." The words drifted into the quiet, carried upward by the sea breeze. Lion flicked his ear, gave a soft, rumbling purr, and pressed his muzzle gently against Stephen's hair. No further answer was needed. In the hush of the night, with the ocean breathing and the sky glowing with endless stars, Stephen understood something simple and profound. Some friends are chosen, some are found, and some, like Lion, are both, a gift from the past, a guardian in the present, and a promise for the future. With that thought cradling his heart, Stephen let his eyes close, his breaths deepen, and sleep carry him gently away, safe in the warmth of a friend who had always been more than a pet. Beach City was never loud in the way great cities are, never sprawling with towers or crowded with hurried feet. It was small, tucked against the sea, where every street seemed to remember the sound of waves, and every window could catch the evening light. For Stephen, it was more than a place to live. It was a landscape woven into his heart, each corner carrying echoes of laughter, comfort, and discovery. The boardwalk creaked under the weight of generations, the fry shop windows glowed with warmth, and the sky above always seemed to blush a little softer than anywhere else. To a stranger it might have looked simple, but to Stephen, Beach City was home, a quiet stage upon which the stories of his childhood unfolded like gentle tides. In the mornings he often woke to the sound of gulls. Their cries were not harsh, but playful, reminding him that the day was waiting. He would step outside with Lion trailing behind him, paws padding softly against the sand, and together they would watch the ocean. The water shimmered with colors that seemed impossible, pale blues and silver streaks that reflected the sky. Sometimes Stephen thought the sea was speaking to him, carrying messages only he could hear. Other times he thought it was just the waves singing their eternal song, and he was simply lucky enough to listen. Either way, he never tired of standing there, letting the salt air wrap around him like a blanket. The people of Beach City were part of this quiet rhythm too. There was Mr. Fryman, always at his stand, always smelling faintly of oil and salt. Stephen loved the way he grumbled about business but still handed out food with a flicker of kindness in his eyes. There was Sadie at the Big Donut, her laughter warm and a little shy, often singing softly when she thought no one was listening.
Lars, too, was there, aloof, restless, trying so hard to be something bigger than this small town, yet tied to it by invisible threads.
To Stephen, they were not just neighbors. They were parts of the larger family that shaped his world. Each one taught him something: patience, humor, resilience, the beauty of being ordinary in extraordinary ways. On afternoons when the sun lingered high, Stephen walked the streets and waved to everyone he met. He had a gift for listening, for leaning in when someone spoke, even if it was only about weather or business. People felt safe with him. They shared worries about storms, excitement about summer festivals, memories of times long gone. He didn't always understand every detail, but he understood their feelings, and that was enough. In those moments, Stephen felt like he belonged not just to the gems, but to Beach City itself, as if his heartbeat kept time with the rhythm of the town. There were small kindnesses that marked his days: helping carry groceries for Mrs. Smiley, who never let her years dim her sparkle; playing with the younger kids who chased kites along the beach, their laughter soaring as high as the strings would let them. Even repairing a mailbox or painting a fence felt like magic, because it was not the task itself, but the connection, the smile it brought, the gratitude in someone's eyes that filled him with warmth. These quiet acts were his adventures, softer than battles, but no less important. Sometimes he would climb to the hill above the temple, where the grass swayed and the sea stretched endlessly before him. From there he could see every rooftop, every street, the carousel turning slowly, the lighthouse standing watch. He imagined each person in their little world below, each carrying hopes, worries, and dreams. The thought made him both small and infinite, part of a tapestry too vast to ever see fully, yet intimate in its nearness. He would lie back in the grass, Lion beside him, clouds drifting above like stories not yet told. The sky always had a way of reminding him that life could be both enormous and tender. Evenings in Beach City carried their own kind of magic. Lights flickered on along the boardwalk, lanterns glowing amber against the gathering dusk. The ocean darkened, stars beginning to shimmer like seeds scattered in a garden of sky. Stephen loved these moments most, when the town seemed to settle into itself, content and gentle. Sometimes music floated from the arcade, sometimes laughter spilled from the pizza shop. But mostly it was quiet, and that quietness carried peace. He would sit on the steps with a sandwich in his hands, watching the town breathe, feeling safe within its familiar heartbeat. Connie often joined him during these evenings. Together they walked along the shoreline, talking about little things, dreams of tomorrow, books Connie had read, silly thoughts Stephen shared without hesitation. Their footsteps left patterns in the sand, erased by the tide soon after, yet each one felt significant. They didn't need grand adventures to feel alive. The simple act of being together, of listening and laughing and sometimes just walking in silence, was enough. Friendship, Stephen realized, was as much about presence as it was about words. Every so often the gems joined these quiet rhythms. Garnet might appear, standing tall and still at the edge of the beach, her gaze on the horizon as if measuring the stars. Amethyst would tumble into the sand, turning even stillness into play, reminding Stephen not to take everything too seriously. Pearl would linger with him on the boardwalk, pointing out constellations with gentle precision, her voice carrying both wisdom and longing. Each of them shaped his nights in different ways, and Beach City embraced them all, even when the mysteries they carried felt larger than the town itself. For Stephen, the beauty of Beach City wasn't in what happened, but in what it allowed. It gave him space to grow, to feel, to learn without pressure. It gave him a canvas upon which his heart could paint small kindnesses, and those kindnesses mattered more than any grand gesture. The quiet moments were the ones that lingered, a shared smile, a whispered thank you, the sight of lanterns swaying in the breeze. Life here was gentle, but in that gentleness was strength. As he drifted through these days, Stephen often found himself reflecting. He wondered what the future held, what paths he might one day walk beyond the borders of this small seaside town. Yet he never felt impatient. He knew that wherever he went, Beach City would live within him. Its streets and faces had etched themselves into his story, becoming part of who he was. Even when he closed his eyes at night, he could hear the gulls, smell the salt air, feel the warmth of lantern light. These memories cradled him like lullabies, promising that home is never truly left behind. One night, lying on the sand with the stars spread wide above, Stephen whispered to Lion, "This place is special, isn't it? It may be small, but it feels like the whole world sometimes." Lion flicked his tail, eyes glinting in the moonlight, as if to say he understood. Stephen smiled, feeling the vastness of the sky and the closeness of the town behind him. Both were real, both belonged to him, and both would guide him into tomorrow. And as the waves kept rolling, steady and endless, Stephen let himself drift towards sleep, heart filled with gratitude for a place where clouds drifted slowly, seagulls circled gently, and kindness lived in the smallest of acts. Beach City was not just where he lived, it was where he learned how to love, how to listen, and how to belong. Stephen's powers had always felt like a mystery to him, blooming slowly like flowers he didn't quite know how to tend. Some days they startled him, arriving in flashes he couldn't control, and other days they refused to appear no matter how much he needed them. Yet beneath the confusion there was always a feeling, quiet but insistent, that these gifts were not just strange abilities, but reflections of his heart. The way his shield appeared when he wanted to protect, the way healing tears rose when he cared too deeply, it all felt less like magic and more like empathy made visible. He remembered the first time he healed a small cut on Connie's hand. It wasn't dramatic. She had nicked herself while turning the page of a book, just a thin red line across her finger. Stephen panicked, rushing to find a bandage, his heart pounding with worry far greater than the injury deserved. But when his tears touched her skin, the cut shimmered and vanished, leaving Connie blinking in surprise. Stephen had stared at her finger, then at his own wet cheeks, stunned by the quiet miracle. It wasn't power in the way cartoons or stories described it. It was tenderness, overflowing, until it changed the world around him. With Lion beside him, Stephen practiced quietly. On the beach, under the wide sky, he would try to summon his shield, by thinking of the people he wanted to protect. Sometimes it came easily, flashing into existence like a sunrise. Other times it refused, leaving him flustered, wondering if he wasn't trying hard enough. But eventually he realized it wasn't about effort. It was about sincerity. The shield did not answer to command. It answered to care. When he pictured his friends laughing, when he thought of the gem's safety, when he remembered how much he loved Beach City, the shield appeared like a promise. His powers often frightened him too. Not because they were dangerous, but because they carried weight. Healing meant he could take away pain, but what if he failed when it mattered most? His shield meant he could protect others, but what if it shattered? These thoughts curled in his chest late at night, making his small room feel heavier than it should. Lion would nudge him with his muzzle, grounding him, reminding him with silence that Stephen did not need to have all the answers right away. Growth, like the ocean's tide, came slowly, steadily, one wave at a time. One afternoon, sitting by the water, Stephen experimented with his breath. He closed his eyes, let the rhythm of the sea guide him, and tried to summon the glow that lived in his gem. He imagined the people he loved, their faces warm in his mind. He thought of Connie's laughter, Garnet's calm, Amethyst's playful energy, Pearl's careful guidance. He thought of Lion's steady companionship. And slowly, light bloomed within him, spreading outward until his skin tingled. He opened his eyes to see the faint shimmer of a shield forming, fragile but real, and he smiled through the quiet surprise. The moment wasn't loud or triumphant. It was peaceful, like the satisfaction of finally humming a tune correctly. Healing became another language he learned to speak, though it never came through force.
He could not summon it like a trick.
It only came when his heart overflowed, when his worry or love spilled out in tears or in touch. He began to understand it as listening so deeply to another's pain that his own heart rose up to answer. Sometimes it was a scraped knee of a child on the boardwalk, sometimes a wilted flower in a pot, sometimes even the silent ache in Lion's tired gaze. His powers stretched beyond what he expected, weaving tenderness into the world, one quiet moment at a time. One quiet moment at a time. There were days when Stephen wondered if these gifts belonged to him at all, or if they were echoes of his mother's. The thought weighed on him, the question of whether he was truly himself or just an extension of her. Yet when Connie squeezed his hand, when the gems smiled at him, when Lion pressed close during the storm, Stephen began to realize something. Even if the powers were inherited, the way he used them was his choice. They were not his mother's heart. They were his. His way of caring, his way of protecting, his way of healing. Sometimes, as the sun lowered and shadows stretched long across the sand, Stephen spoke aloud to the waves. "I don't always know what I'm doing," he admitted softly, "but I think
maybe that's okay. Maybe it's not about knowing.
Maybe it's about trying." The waves offered no answer, but the steady pull of the tide felt like agreement. Lion's tail flicked, brushing sand over Stephen's bare toes, and Stephen laughed gently, feeling comfort seep into his bones. The town grew used to his little miracles. Children who fell while chasing kites would run to Stephen, not crying, but hopeful. He would kneel, listen, and let his touch remind them that pain could fade. Adults shook their heads in wonder, calling it strange, but none could deny the kindness in his eyes.
He never sought recognition, never asked for thanks.
To him, the real power was not the healing itself, but the way people's faces softened afterward, lighter and relieved, as if the world had become gentler for a moment. That was enough. Connie often reminded him that strength could be quiet. "You don't need to fight dragons or villains," she said once, as they sat under a tree sharing a sandwich.
"Sometimes strength is just
being there when someone needs you." Stephen nodded, chewing thoughtfully, feeling the truth of her words settle in his chest. He didn't want to be a warrior. He wanted to be someone who made people feel safe. That was his dream, and his powers, strange as they were, seemed to be guiding him toward it on a late summer night. When the stars scattered like spilled salt across the sky, Stephen lay on the sand with his shield resting beside him. It glowed faintly, reflecting starlight, and for the first time he didn't see it as a burden. He saw it as a part of him, as natural as his laughter, as true as his love. The shield wasn't heavy, it was steady. It was the shape of his heart, made visible for the world to see. He whispered to the night, not sure if anyone heard. "I don't think powers make you special."
I think love does.
"And maybe powers are just
Love with a little light." The words hung there, drifting upward, until they dissolved into the wide silence of the stars.
Stephen closed his eyes, hand resting on Lion's mane, and felt a deep calm settle within him. The ocean sang softly. The town lights twinkled faint behind him, and Stephen, caught between worlds of human and gem, drifted towards sleep with the quiet certainty that his powers were not burdens at all. They were songs of the heart, waiting to be sung whenever love called for them. Stephen sometimes felt that his life was built from questions. They hovered around him like clouds, always near, always shifting, never quite solid enough to touch. At the center of them all was the same mystery, the life of Rose Quartz, the mother he never met, whose shadow stretched across his days. She had left him love, yes, and a family of gems who tried their best to guide him. But she had also left silences, decisions unspoken, secrets tucked away in places Stephen stumbled upon only by accident. The weight of those secrets pressed on him softly, like a heavy blanket at night, both comforting and stifling. Lion carried some of them in his mane, rooms full of forgotten treasures that Stephen explored in cautious wonder.
A sword, a tattered flag, a videotape with his mother's voice.
Each item pulled him closer to her, and at the same time farther from certainty. He would sit with them, sometimes alone, sometimes with the gems nearby, trying to piece together a story that refused to arrange itself neatly.
"Why didn't she tell me more?"
he whispered once, voice trembling. The items gave no reply, and Lion only blinked, calm and silent. The gems, too, carried their silences. Pearl's eyes would soften whenever Rose's name came up, and her voice turned into something fragile, like glass, touched by too much light. Amethyst avoided the subject altogether, her laughter a mask over questions she didn't want to face. Garnet spoke the least, her calm steady but unreadable, as if she held answers Stephen wasn't ready to know. He loved them, trusted them, but he could feel the unspoken truths humming beneath every word. It wasn't anger that filled him, it was longing, a yearning to understand not just what happened, but who he was within it all. Sometimes he wondered if he was meant to carry the burden of those secrets, as though his life was not his own, but a continuation of hers. That thought frightened him. He wanted to believe he could choose his own path, but how could he when her choices still shaped every step? He lay awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, his gem faintly glowing, and asked into the dark, "Am I me, or just her?" The night gave him no answer. Only the steady hum of the ocean outside, as if reminding him that questions could exist without resolution. There were moments of clarity, brief and luminous. Once, sitting with Connie under the lighthouse, he confessed his fears. She listened quietly, her eyes kind, and then said, "You don't need all the answers to be yourself. You're Stephen. That's already enough." Her words soothed him for a while, like cool water on overheated skin. But the questions always returned, tugging at him, pressing him to look deeper into the past. Walking through Beach City, Stephen sometimes saw his mother's absence reflected in small ways. A stranger would pause when they looked at him, recognition flickering across their face, as though they saw echoes of Rose in his smile or his stance. "You remind me of her," they would say, and Stephen would smile politely, but inside he felt the weight of their expectations. He wanted to ask them what she had been like, but feared the answers. What if they told him things that made him doubt the woman he had only known through stories? What if he learned that her love was not as perfect as he hoped? Lion remained his quiet confidant in these times. Stephen would curl against the great pink mane and whisper his worries into the fur. He imagined the mane carrying those words into the hidden spaces, storing them with the rest of Rose's belongings, keeping them safe until he was strong enough to hear the truth. Sometimes Lion gave a low, rumbling sound, half sigh, half purr, and Stephen chose to believe it meant understanding. The truth about secrets is that they are not always cruel. Sometimes they exist to protect, to give time, to shield, until the right moment. Stephen tried to remind himself of this when the frustration grew heavy. Maybe Rose hadn't meant to burden him. Maybe she had hoped the gems would know when to tell him more. But the waiting hurt, and the wondering pulled at him like a tide he could not resist. There was a day when Pearl showed him a sword technique, her movements sharp and elegant, and Stephen asked softly, "Did she use it this way too?" Pearl froze for a breath, eyes distant, and then nodded without words. The silence that followed was heavier than the lesson itself. Stephen didn't push. He had learned that answers often carried sorrow, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to hold both at once. The ocean became his place of refuge during these times. He would sit where the sand met the water, letting the tide wash around his ankles. The horizon stretched wide, endless and unknowable, much like the questions in his heart. Watching it calmed him. It reminded him that not everything needed to be solved in a single moment. Some truths, like stars, only revealed themselves slowly as the night deepened. Stephen began to practice patience. When the weight of secrets pressed too hard, he reminded himself that he didn't have to carry them all alone. He leaned on Connie's steady friendship, on the gem's quiet support, on Lion's unwavering presence. Piece by piece he accepted that the mysteries would unfold in their own time, and that his role was not to solve them all at once, but to keep living gently in the meantime. Gently in the meantime. The passing of time was something Stephen began to notice, not in years or seasons, but in the subtle changes of tone and texture around him. The boardwalk creaked a little more when he walked across it. Greg's hair carried a few more strands of grey, glinting in the sun when he leaned down to tune his guitar. Even the gems, though ancient and ageless in their way, showed tiny shifts, a pause in Pearl's movements when she watched Stephen master something new, a deeper calm in Garnet's silence, Amethyst's laughter mellowing ever so slightly as she lingered longer during quiet evenings. These changes were not loud, but they were steady, like the tide reshaping the still. The longing remained, a soft ache like a song half remembered. He wanted to hear her voice again, not through a recording, but as a conversation. He wanted to ask her why she had chosen to leave so much unsaid, and whether she believed in him as much as everyone else claimed. Until that day could come, Stephen carried the weight with as much grace as he could. He smiled, he healed, he laughed, and he listened. He let life continue, even with the unanswered questions humming quietly beneath it all. One evening, as the sky deepened to violet, Stephen whispered into the air, "I'll find out in time. I don't need everything now." The stars twinkled faintly above, as if acknowledging his words. Lion's head rested heavily against his shoulder, and Stephen felt the comfort of companionship seep into his bones. He realized then that secrets were not just burdens. They were also bridges, waiting for him to cross when he was ready. He closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the waves carry him inward. The questions were still there, hovering like clouds, but they no longer pressed so hard. They could wait. For now, he had the sound of the ocean, the warmth of Lion beside him, and the knowledge that love, even when tangled with secrets, was still love. And that was enough to let him drift towards sleep, heart steady, body relaxed, mind slowly quieting beneath the stars. There are moments so small that they almost slip past unnoticed, yet they linger in memory longer than grand events. For Stephen, these moments began to weave themselves into the fabric of his days, quiet threads of meaning that stitched him gently to the world around him. He realized that not every answer he sought would come in revelations or secrets unlocked. Sometimes the truth lived in ordinary exchanges, the pauses between words, the smiles shared when nothing needed to be said. These were the gifts that came without ceremony, yet glowed with a warmth he carried long after the moment ended. One morning, he woke to find Amethyst sprawled across the living room floor, her hair wild, her laughter still echoing from a dream she hadn't fully shaken. "Breakfast?" she mumbled, half asleep. Stephen laughed softly and offered her a plate of toast. It was nothing extraordinary, just bread browned by heat, yet when she took a bite and grinned, he felt something settle in him.
Love did not always roar like the ocean.
Sometimes it hummed, quiet and steady, like the crunch of toast shared between friends. Later that day, he sat on the porch with Garnet. The sun hung low, its golden light painting the world in warmth. Garnet rarely spoke much, but her presence was its own comfort. She adjusted her shades and said, almost casually, "You're doing well." Stephen tilted his head, uncertain.
Am I? Garnet's lips curved into the faintest of smiles.
"Yes, because you notice the small things. That's how people grow." Her words sank deep into him, anchoring in a place that felt fragile but strong. The gift she gave him was not in explanations or secrets revealed, but in assurance, a reminder that growth could be measured not by battles fought, but by hearts softened. Pearl, too, had her ways of giving. She carried her sorrows carefully, like glass she refused to drop. Yet when Stephen practiced sword drills with her, he felt her trust. She corrected his stance, her voice firm but gentle, and when he finally managed a clean movement, she looked at him with pride that almost startled her. For Stephen, the gift was not the technique itself, but the glimpse of her faith in him, the soft flicker of belief that bridged her grief and his hope. Even the citizens of Beach City offered him treasures in their own subtle ways. Ronaldo rambled about theories under the lighthouse, his wild imagination spilling into the night, and though most of it made little sense, Stephen cherished the way he shared without fear. Sadie handed him sandwiches when he passed by the Big Donut, shrugging as though it were nothing, though Stephen knew kindness never was nothing. Lars grumbled, but still let Stephen linger near, pretending not to care while secretly glad for the company. Each small act was like a pebble placed gently in Stephen's pocket, weightless at first, yet together grounding him to the world he belonged to. Connie, of course, was different. With her, every small moment became luminous, touched by the quiet intensity of her friendship. One afternoon, they sat side by side reading, the ocean wind tugging at the pages. Neither spoke for a long time. Then Connie glanced up and said softly, "Isn't it amazing how stories make us feel less alone?" Stephen nodded, his throat tightening. That one sentence was enough to carry him through days when the silence of unanswered questions grew too heavy. Lion offered his own quiet gifts. Sometimes it was just the warmth of lying down beside Stephen, other times a sudden portal to somewhere forgotten, as if reminding Stephen that the past could be visited but never fully held.
Once Lion led him to a meadow where the sky opened wide, unbroken.
Stephen lay there on the grass, the clouds drifting lazily above, and felt the truth settle in his chest. Not everything had to be solved. Some things only needed to be experienced. The rhythm of life began to take on this shape, small, steady gifts folded into each day. Stephen found comfort in sweeping the porch with Greg, the bristles of the broom scratching softly against the wood. He found joy in laughing with Kiki as she told him stories from her shifts at the pizza shop. He found peace in watching the tide move in and out, a rhythm older than him, older even than the gems, endless and forgiving. There were nights, of course, when the questions returned, pressing into his heart. But Stephen began to realize that answers alone would not quiet him. What gave him rest were the tiny, luminous memories being created around him, the ones he could carry like lanterns into the dark. When he replayed them in his mind, he felt steadier. The darkness did not vanish, but it no longer frightened him as it once did. He thought often of his mother during these times. Rose had left him mysteries, yes, but she had also left him a world filled with people who loved him in their own imperfect ways. Perhaps that was her greatest gift, the connections she set in motion, the bonds that grew around him like vines, binding him not with chains, but with care. He wondered if she had known that love was best expressed not only in grand gestures, but in the quiet, ordinary threads that kept life together. One evening, as the sky deepened into indigo, Stephen sat on the beach with Connie. They watched the waves crash and fade, and he said, almost in a whisper, "Do you think all these little things matter?" Connie looked at him, eyes glowing in the moonlight. "I think they're the only things that do." Her certainty wrapped around him like a blanket. He felt the ache of longing soften, replaced by gratitude for the tiny miracles already surrounding him. The world was still mysterious. The past was still tangled. But Stephen was beginning to see that meaning did not live only in answers or revelations. It lived in the way Amethyst laughed too loudly, in the way Garnet's silence spoke volumes, in the way Pearl's pride peeked through her sorrow, in the way his father's songs drifted over the car wash at twilight. It lived in the taste of doughnuts, in the salt on the wind, in the softness of Lion's mane against his cheek. These were the gifts of small moments, and they were his to keep. That night, lying in his bed with the window open to the night air, Stephen felt calm. He whispered into the quiet, "Thank you," not knowing exactly who he was thanking. His mother, his friends, the universe itself. The word floated out like a feather, light and unhurried, landing softly in the dark. The stars shimmered faintly above, as if returning the sentiment. Stephen's breath slowed, his body softened into the mattress, and he let the memory of every small gift cradle him into sleep. Or Stephen wondered if this was what growth truly felt like. Not sudden transformations or revelations, but gradual ripples, soft reminders that nothing stays the same. He had once thought growing up meant answers, clarity, a neat line drawn from past to future. But now he sensed that it was less about what you knew and more about how you carried what you did not know. Time, like sand through his fingers, was impossible to hold completely. Yet the act of holding even a little bit, the warmth of a moment before it slipped away, was enough. There were evenings when Greg would strum his guitar on the steps of the car wash, and Stephen would sit nearby, humming along. Sometimes they talked, other times they just let the music drift between them. Greg told stories of his younger days, when he was wild and unsure, when he met Rose under a canopy of stars. He spoke softly, voice laced with nostalgia, and Stephen listened with a mix of wonder and quiet ache. Each word was a window into a life Stephen had not lived, but somehow belonged to. And yet Greg's stories were never about grandeur. They were about small choices, hesitations, moments of courage no one else noticed. Stephen began to realize that his father's gift was not just love, but the reminder that ordinary days could be the most extraordinary of all. Sometimes, Stephen thought about how the gems seemed untouched by time, yet changed by it all the same. Pearl had learned to laugh a little more easily, though her laughter always carried a tremor, like glass vibrating. Amethyst grew more comfortable in herself, no longer trying to be anyone else, but letting her messy, vibrant spirit be enough. Garnet remained steady, though Stephen began to see more clearly the small tenderness in her stillness, the way she rested her hands on his shoulders for just a moment longer, the way her gaze softened when he spoke. These subtle evolutions filled him with quiet awe. Time was not erasing them. It was polishing them, revealing deeper layers beneath the surface. Beach City itself bore its own rhythm of change. Stores closed, new ones opened, boardwalk stalls shifted. Faces came and went, though the familiar ones remained like anchors. Stephen cherished the comfort of knowing that Sadie would still wave when he passed the Big Donut, that Kiki would still offer him a slice of pizza on slow nights, that Ronaldo would still share theories that spiraled far beyond reason. These consistencies, woven with the inevitable changes, made the town feel alive, breathing in harmony with him. One night, as Stephen lay awake, he found himself reflecting on the nature of memory. Memories, he realized, were not perfect recordings. They bent and shifted, softened at the edges, blurred like watercolor. But that did not make them less real. If anything, it made them more alive, reshaped with every retelling, every recollection. He thought about his mother, and how every story about her was tinged with the perspective of the one who told it. Pearl's memories were filled with devotion and sorrow. Amethyst's memories carried both rebellion and longing. Garnet's memories seemed to stretch beyond words, too vast to explain. Even Greg's recollections were wrapped in the glow of love and regret. Stephen understood now that he would never see a single, sharp picture of rose quartz. He would only ever hold the kaleidoscope, the fragments of her that shimmered through those who loved her. And maybe that was enough. Connie once told him that memories were like stars. Some burned bright and close, while others were distant, their light traveling across ages just to reach your eyes. By the time you see them, she said softly, the star itself might be long gone, but the light is still here, still real. Stephen thought about that often. He imagined his mother as one of those stars, her choices, her presence, sending out light that still reached him long after she was gone. It comforted him to think that even if he could not touch her, he was still living in the glow she left behind. The passage of time also revealed itself in Stephen's own body. He caught himself growing taller, his voice carrying new weight. He still felt like a child some days, yet mirrors told him he was changing. His gem pulsed with a steadier light, no longer uncertain, but grounded. It frightened him a little, this reminder that he was moving forward whether or not he was ready. Yet it also filled him with pride. He was not the boy who stumbled clumsily into battles anymore. He was becoming someone who could listen, who could comfort, who could heal. Not just wounds on the body, but wounds in the heart. On a quiet afternoon, Stephen sat with Lion in the meadow. The sky stretched endlessly, clouds drifting in no rush. He rested against Lion's mane, breathing slowly, and thought about how far he had come. The questions were still there, like soft echoes, but they no longer demanded answers the way they once had. Instead, they lingered like companions, reminders of the journey still unfolding. Time, he realized, was not something to conquer. It was something to befriend. The greatest gift of passing time, Stephen understood, was the way it allowed people to soften toward each other.
Arguments from months ago no longer stung so sharply.
Misunderstandings faded into laughter. The hurts he once carried began to feel lighter, their edges dulled by days and nights filled with love. He saw this in the gems too, in the way Pearl and Amethyst learned to forgive each other, in the way Garnet offered reassurance instead of silence, in the way Greg allowed himself to rest without guilt. Time had not erased their struggles, but it had given them the chance to grow around them, like trees stretching higher, even with knots in their trunks. That night, as the ocean whispered against the shore, Stephen whispered back, "Thank you for giving me time." He did not know if he was speaking to his mother, to the universe, or to himself. perhaps it did not matter. The words floated gently into the dark, joining the endless rhythm of waves and stars. Time would continue to move, carrying him with it, reshaping him, softening him. And as he lay down to sleep, Stephen felt no urgency, no fear, only a quiet trust that the passing of time was itself a kind of love, patient and endless, holding him close even as it carried him forward. There were nights when Stephen felt that the universe itself was listening. The stars shimmered in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, and the waves whispered, as if carrying stories from places beyond sight. On these nights he lay awake not with worry, but with wonder, his heart opening wide to the quiet expanse around him. He thought of how small he was within the endlessness of time and space, and yet how deeply loved he was in the small corner of the world he called home. The balance between the vast and the intimate filled him with a peace that settled slowly, like sand drifting to the bottom of the sea. One such evening, he wandered down to the beach after everyone had gone to rest. The tide was low, leaving behind rippled pools that mirrored the moonlight. He crouched beside one and saw his reflection shimmering alongside the stars above. For a long time, he just watched, breathing in the salty air, letting the cool breeze brush against his skin. In that moment, he realized something simple yet profound. He was both the boy reflected in the water and the boy gazing into it. He was past and present, known and unknown, held together by the gentle thread of now. The gems joined him more often in these quiet wanderings. Pearls sometimes carried lanterns down to the shoreline, their soft glow painting halos in the night. She walked slowly as though each step was part of a ritual. Stephen would ask her questions, not heavy ones, but small, tender ones. "What's your favorite sound at night?" She paused, then said, "The sound of the tide retreating. It reminds me that even departures can be graceful." Stephen carried that answer with him, feeling the truth of it echo in his own heart. Amethyst brought levity, throwing stones into the tide pools, laughing when the splashes startled crabs from their hiding places. Yet even in her laughter there was gentleness. She handed Stephen a smooth stone once, pressing it into his palm.
"This one's lucky," she said, half teasing, half sincere.
Stephen kept it in his pocket for days afterward, rubbing its surface whenever uncertainty grew too sharp. The gift was small, but it carried her care. Garnet rarely spoke during these midnight walks. She stood beside Stephen, her silhouette strong and quiet against the horizon. Every so often, she would rest her hand briefly on his shoulder, steadying without words. From her, Stephen learned that silence could be its own form of comfort, a language that did not require translation. Just her presence reminded him that he did not need to carry anything alone. Greg, too, had his place in these late-night reflections. Sometimes he brought his guitar, strumming softly as the waves joined in harmony. Other times he told Stephen about the sky, the way he used to drive for hours just to chase the horizon, the dreams he once had of becoming something bigger than himself. "Funny thing," Greg murmured one night. "You spend all this time chasing big dreams, and then you realize the best parts are the small ones."
"Like sitting here with you." Stephen leaned against him, closing his eyes, letting the simple truth sink deep. The simple truth sink deep.
Connie became part of these gatherings as well. She carried books, reading aloud under the stars. Her voice wove stories of faraway lands, heroes with burdens, journeys that mirrored Stephen's own in strange and subtle ways. He loved listening, not just to the words, but to the steady rhythm of her voice. Sometimes, when she stopped to rest, Stephen whispered, "I like your stories better than the ones in books." She laughed softly, and the sound felt like the turning of a page in a story he never wanted to end. These quiet nights became a rhythm of their own, moments of connection layered gently over one another. They did not answer the larger mysteries, but they gave Stephen something perhaps more valuable, a sense of belonging that glowed even in silence. He realized that the universe did not only speak in revelations or battles, more often it spoke in lantern light, in stones pressed into palms, in music played softly against the tide, in stories whispered under constellations. Stephen began to dream differently during this time. His dreams were no longer filled with battles or questions about his mother. Instead, they unfolded like lullabies, scenes of walking along beaches that stretched forever, of climbing staircases that led to glowing skies, of holding hands with those he loved as the world around them shimmered like crystal. He would wake with a sense of calm, as though the dreams were reminding him that peace was not something far away, but something that could live quietly within him. One dream lingered longer than the rest. In it, he found himself standing before a garden filled with roses, each one glowing faintly with starlight. He knew without being told that it was connected to his mother. But instead of questions rising in him, he felt only warmth. He walked among the roses, touching their petals, hearing faint echoes of laughter and love in their rustling leaves. At the center of the garden stood a stone fountain, still and clear. When Stephen looked into its water, he did not see Rose, he saw himself, smiling softly. He woke with tears on his cheeks, not from sorrow, but from a feeling so full it overflowed. The next evening he told Connie about the dream. She listened, her eyes shining, and said, "Maybe it means you don't have to choose between being her and being yourself. Maybe you're both, her love and your own spirit." Stephen nodded, holding her words close. It felt like an answer he had been waiting for, but one he had only been ready to hear now after so many quiet nights of learning patience. The world kept moving, as it always did. The tide rose and fell, the stars shifted their places in the sky, the town lights blinked out one by one as people went to sleep. And Stephen, sitting among his family and friends, realized that the universe was not something he had to conquer or understand entirely. It was something he was already part of in every breath, every glance, every laugh shared in the dark. The vastness no longer frightened him. It comforted him, because he knew that even in its endlessness, he had a place. That night, as he lay down to sleep, Stephen whispered once more into the quiet, "Thank you." He did not need to know who he was thanking. The words themselves were enough, carried on the night air like a soft melody. His breathing slowed, his body relaxed, and he drifted into rest with the certainty that he was held not just by those around him, but by the universe itself, infinite and gentle, carrying him into dreams. Morning sunlight spilled across the beach like honey, warm and slow, stretching its glow over the familiar sands. Stephen stood at the water's edge, toes sinking gently into the wet ground, and watched the waves slide toward him, each one folding into the next in an endless, patient rhythm. There was nothing unusual about this morning. No missions awaited him, no secrets pressed against his chest. Yet something in the air felt different, as if the world itself was taking a long breath. It was the kind of day that whispered of change, not the loud kind that storms through lives, but the quiet sort that arrives with the dawn and lingers unnoticed until you realize everything is subtly new. He found himself thinking about beginnings, about the strange, beautiful way his life had unfolded, how a boy who once felt too small for the legacy left to him had grown into someone who could stand at the edge of the sea and feel at home. He remembered moments that had shaped him. The first time he healed a wound with a tear, the first time he fused with Connie, the first time he looked into Lion's mane and saw more than emptiness. Each memory was a stepping stone, uneven and scattered, but together they formed a path that led him here. It struck him, as the tide lapped softly at his feet, that he had been walking that path even when he didn't know it existed. Greg joined him not long after, carrying 2 mugs of tea. They stood in silence for a while, sipping and watching the water. "You've grown up a lot, kiddo," Greg said eventually, his voice touched with both pride and wistfulness. Stephen smiled, feeling warmth bloom in his chest.
"I still feel like I'm figuring things out," Greg chuckled.
That never really stops. Figuring things out is kind of the point. Stephen thought about that for a long time after his father left, the words echoing gently in the quiet spaces of his heart. Maybe there was no final version of himself to arrive at. Maybe he was meant to keep unfolding, layer by layer, like petals opening under the sun. Later that day, Connie stopped by. They walked through Beach City, pointing out little changes neither had noticed before. A new sign outside Fish Stew Pizza, a mural painted on the wall near the arcade, a tree growing taller than either of them remembered.
"It's funny," Connie said, "how things change even when you're not paying attention." Stephen nodded.
Maybe that's how people change too. Not in sudden leaps, but in quiet ways we don't see until we look back. She smiled at that, and the simplicity of it felt profound. As the afternoon faded, Stephen visited the temple. The gems were there, each busy with something small, pearl polishing ancient artifacts, amethyst stacking stones for no reason other than to see how high they could go, Garnet gazing out the window, her expression unreadable but calm. They all paused when Stephen entered, and for a moment they just looked at one another. It was the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled, heavy with everything they had shared. "We're proud of you," Pearl said softly, and the others nodded. Stephen's chest tightened. It wasn't the first time they had said it, but this time it felt different, like an acknowledgement not just of what he had done, but of who he had become. They spent the evening together, cooking dinner, telling stories, laughing about old misadventures. Amethyst teased him about his childhood mishaps. Pearl shared distant memories of places Stephen had never seen, and Garnet offered her quiet, grounding wisdom between smiles. It felt like a celebration without fanfare, a gathering not for any specific reason, but for the simple joy of being together. As the stars emerged outside, Stephen looked around at the faces he loved and felt a swell of gratitude, so deep it almost hurt. Later that night, he and Lion walked out beyond the city limits, following a path lit by moonlight. They stopped in a clearing where the sky stretched endlessly, the stars scattered like grains of salt across a dark table. Stephen lay back in the grass, staring upward, his hands folded behind his head. The vastness of it no longer intimidated him the way it once had. Instead, it filled him with a sense of belonging. He was a small part of something enormous, yes, but he was a part of it all the same. His life, his joys, his mistakes, his love were threads in the great tapestry above. He thought of his mother then, not with the ache that used to twist in his chest, but with a gentler, deeper feeling. She was a part of this story, but she was not the whole of it. Her choices had shaped his beginning, but his choices had shaped everything that followed.
And maybe that was the secret he had been seeking all along. He was not meant to solve her mystery, but to live his own story.
Carrying the best of what she had given him while making something entirely new from it. As a soft wind stirred the grass, Stephen whispered into the night, "I forgive you." The words drifted upward, weightless, and though there was no reply, he felt a quiet shift inside him, as though a door long closed had finally opened. It was not about forgetting or excusing. It was about letting go of the burden he had carried since the day he learned who she was. It was about stepping forward unshackled, ready for whatever came next. Ready for whatever came next.
Lion nuzzled against him and Stephen laughed softly, scratching behind his mane.
"We've come a long way, haven't we?" Lion purred in response, and together they watched the stars in comfortable silence. Time stretched and folded around them, and for once, Stephen did not feel the need to rush toward the future or reach back for the past. He was exactly where he needed to be, here now in the gentle hum of the present. As he walked home under the glow of the moon, Stephen felt lighter than he had in years. The town slept peacefully around him, the boardwalk empty and still. He passed the Big Donut, the car wash, the lighthouse, places that held pieces of his story, each one a chapter etched into who he was. The world was quiet, but it did not feel empty. It felt full of love, of memories, of endless possibilities waiting just beyond the horizon. When he reached his room, he climbed into bed and stared out the window at the stars.
"Thank you," he whispered again, not just to his mother, but to every person, every moment, every twist and turn that had led him here.
Life, he realized, was not a puzzle to solve. It was a song to be sung softly and sincerely, one note at a time. And as his eyes grew heavy and his breath slowed, he felt that song carrying him gently into sleep, warm and whole beneath the vast, forgiving sky. And so the story settles, like the tide returning to shore, never truly ending, only flowing onward in quieter waves. What began in questions has softened into understanding, and what was once heavy has grown lighter with time. These chapters are not a final conclusion, but a reminder that growth, love, and forgiveness continue in small, unseen ways. May these words rest with you like a lullaby, carrying you gently towards stillness, reminding you that even in uncertainty, you are part of something vast, bright, and unending.